Let's jump into the compliance a little bit. This is obviously one of the biggest areas that people think about and have to contend with when they start to bring in held away and other outside accounts. So we'll run through the regulatory framework, the custody rule that changed in 2010 and how that's impacting everybody, your agreement with your clients and what must be in that agreement and how to go about handling it. And of course, there's books and records requirements that you have once you take data. Anything that you use in the operation of your business becomes official books and records that need to be maintained. And then, of course, the CCO's role in this equation and how to gain the efficiency on both the client and the operational end of this. So jumping right into the framework, there's 4 core rule sets here to think through. Supervision. The CCO is required under 20647 of the Advisors Act to basically implement a compliance program that's designed to prevent, detect, and correct any violations of the securities laws. So the CCO needs to make sure that for the core accounts that you're managing, all of your investment processes, and any data that you're bringing in or sending out of the firm, that you're meeting everything from data privacy to good controls on the accuracy of data, and then all the way down to the maintenance of the books and records. The custody rule really defines your access to client funds and the implications there. And this is obviously a major area that's cropped up over the last few years, and, especially with the scandals that came out and the various frauds that were there. So the regulators did kind of overreach here on the custody rule, from my opinion, but it's all in, all has the right intent behind that, and for the same reason you do what you do, it's to protect the client and protect their assets. So there are a few nuances there to the rules that you need to be very well aware of, and the first bullet point is very straightforward. Access to their funds and securities equals custody. But we often hear questions about the second one, that deducting your fees is actually also custody. But there are safeguards out there that help make sure that you mitigate and don't have to live with the implications of custody. And we'll chat about that along the way. The other key point is access to the client's accounts and how you get into these accounts. So having a client's username and password generally equals custody, because you have the ability to go in as if you're the client and affect the transaction. So many 401k plans and other custodial accounts are creating some safeguards to make sure that there is everything from follow-up statements to security codes and other components to prevent and mitigate that instance there. But we strongly encourage that you utilize technologies out there. For instance, the File Accounts, the host here, allows for their clients, allows for your clients rather, to log into a secure portal to give you access into their account. So you don't have to ask for the username and password. And we recognize that it's often very difficult to get this information from the clients, and clients are often just pushing on you to take care of it. So it's really one of those areas you definitely have to balance, because the implications and the cost of dealing with custody is often not worth the distraction of just getting a client focused for a few minutes to help you in this next step. And if they fully understand and appreciate the goals that you're trying to set forth for them, they'll find the time and they'll be accommodating. We'll talk about the client agreements, but the key thing here, especially for existing clients where you're going to take on and add held away accounts, is that you can't change the agreement without client's consent. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then lastly, any record that's been utilized in your business. So anything that's derived, anything that's produced in your business needs to be retained for at least 5 years. So take that into consideration. It need not be physical storage. It can be electronic. It can often even be delegated, but you can't delegate your accountability. So if the records are gone, even if it's a service provider or partner, you can't just point the finger. You're accountable for that. Let's jump into the custody rule in a little more detail here. We talked about the ability to withdraw funds from any account, of course, equals custody, as does the ability to move cash and security between accounts for your clients. The deduction of advisory fees, it's technical custody, and the safeguards around this are that you have a client agreement, and depending on whether you're state or SEC registered, there's different safeguards. But basically, utilizing a qualified custodian, having a client agreement that provides the authorization, and of course, one of the key things is that when you invoice your custodian to get your fees deducted, you also send, and this is for state advisors, you also send a copy of that methodology over to the client. So it can take the form of an invoice, or it can take a less formal form, as long as they can recalc the fee. So that becomes important, especially when you're starting to aggregate accounts, because you need to be able to provide the math. So it's an important consideration in your business planning around this here. The other components here are very straightforward. The custody rules have changed to, if you're serving as a trustee or paying bills, you have custody. But let's talk about the last one. Access into the client account via their credentials generally equates to custody, because very, very few systems have safeguards to prevent the owner from making changes to their account. But the last one is also very important as well. I mean, if you can change where statements go, or where emails go, or any other information on the client account is directed, that's viewed as being custody. Just in that, even if you never touch the actual cash or assets, it's viewed that there's the possibility of doing that. So you want to make sure that you're doing the proper due diligence on any held away account to make sure that you're not inadvertently accepting custody, even by going in to check to see what's going on in that particular account. And again, that's where technology can be a real enabler for this. So along the theme of avoiding custody, if you have 401k accounts or accounts at other custodians, at the retail brokerage account of a custodial arm where you don't have a relationship, you need to do the due diligence. You need to call that custodian. You need to go in and find out how you can get access to the account without going and triggering custody. You need to go through and find out and work with your clients to log in and get access to information. And one real important thing is, sometimes you'll be in a client's account and realize that there aren't the safeguards that you were hoping were there. And our advice to that is, while you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, you can at least document what you were doing and why you were doing it. So we strongly encourage that any due diligence process, that you document the testing that you're doing, the date and time, and the results of that. And it not only makes for good evidence that you truly understand and appreciate the securities laws, but it is also an additional safeguard there for you as well. And then due diligence is not a one-time event. So all of the providers are continually enhancing their service offerings. Technology changes, clients change their accounts. So you need to make sure that you're performing regular due diligence to make sure that you're acting in the best interest of the client and not running afoul of any compliance rules. With respect to the technology, again, getting access to that data without access to the client account in a physical manner is very, very helpful from a compliance perspective, but it also provides you the information and the tools to handle other aspects of the risk management. Let's jump into the client agreements. A proper agreement with the client to enable held away accounts has to have numerous factors or numerous provisions in it. But we pull out a few of them here that we want to highlight. First is the authority to deduct your fees, but you also need to make sure and look at the language that you have the authority to deduct your fees across the board or in specific accounts, other than the primary custodian in which you're managing assets. So often we see a lot of client agreements that were written very broadly to say that you have this authority, But that authority, may not technically extend because it's often tied to the definition of an account. And if that account is defined as the account at ABC Custodian, well then you're going to need to rewrite that agreement in order, or at least an addendum to that section, in order to have the ability to do any billing off of that account. Along the same lines is, defining what the custody and relationships do look like. It's often advisable to create these as schedules or addendums in case there's changes. So clients are likely to move assets around over the duration of your relationship, and you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're effectively working without a contract. So make sure that you build in provisions that you can easily change one segment of a client agreement if you ever need to. And of course, usually the client's intent here is to try to make things easy for you as well. So don't be afraid to fax over to a client and have them, sign and return a one-page schedule to talk about some differences of where a client account might be held and what your level of access might be. It's an area that you shouldn't have too much concern with. We talked about the calculation methodology. If you're a state advisor, you do want to make sure that your agreement actually spells out what that methodology is. So if the assets are held away and not at your primary custodian, who's calculating the values? What date are those values as of? How do you assemble them, and how do you calculate a total market value? And then how does that reporting get out to the client? So virtually every state now has adopted a policy that states in order to avoid custody, every time you deduct your fees, you need to make sure that the client has receives either before or shortly thereafter, depending on the state, a copy of what that methodology is so that they can pick up a statement from the custodian and compare that line item for the fees that you deducted. The other part here, in terms of how and where the accounts will be billed, the ideal way to do this is actually to create a schedule and list out what budgets that you have, and you can try to do this in a broad sense as well, but group them by institution where they're being managed instead of just at the account level, but determine where the accounts are and where they're being billed from. So you often have the ability to not directly invoice on a held away account, but to bill it to another account that you're managing, likely at your primary custodian. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And of course, again, technology becomes a major enabler here. Access to the account data makes it feasible for you to actually calculate the assets that you need to do the billing, provides you the data and information that you're going to need to provide to the client accounts. So let's jump into some other aspects here. Next, let's talk about the client agreement. A proper client agreement is essential for the ability to access held away accounts as well as manage any aspect of the client relationship. And in preparing your client agreements, you want to make sure that they have full alignment with the strategy and what you're actually going to execute on behalf of the client and how you're going to bill on behalf of those services. So make sure that the client agreement does address all these key areas of the relationship. So what is the level of authority you have? What are the services that you're planning to offer, and what are the levels, if any, that are options or delivery mechanisms there? What are accounts that are in the scope? And equally important is what's out of scope. Often we see client agreements that are very broad that assume that they cover everything. And I think that there are certainly implications of that where the client agreement can't, the client agreement can't cover all aspects of a client relationship, especially if you can't define what those aspects are. So really need to think through what the scope of the services to be offered, the accountability of the advisor to deliver on those services, and then the responsibilities of the client to provide or hold up their end of the bargain, making sure that you're requiring the client to give you appropriate information and other aspects pertinent to the agreement. So you can only act and deliver advice if you have the correct information to do so. And then getting more mechanical, into the held away accounts is, what is your methodology? Where are the accounts held? Where are they going to be billed? How are you going to keep all of your records? And, very important, and one of the key topics of the last couple of years is custody. How do you do this in a manner that doesn't give you the implications of custody and expose you to surprise audits and balance sheet requirements and other increased financial requirements along the way? Next, let's look at the books and records and the requirements of the Advisors Act and the various state regulators. And we've talked about this throughout the equation, but just remember that any records that you derive in the operation of your business become required books and records that must be maintained for at least 5 years from the end of the year when they were last used in your advisory practice. So make sure that you have a process in place to capture all of this data. In some instances, you can delegate the authority to maintain these, but you can never delegate your accountability. And what we mean by that is, if you're leveraging a technology provider or a custodian to maintain certain books and records, you need to make sure that you can access them, and you can't just assume that they're big or they're a reputable business or they must have safeguards to validate that, in fact, they're meeting their requirements. It does require due inquiry and inspection, which is reasonable given that you deem to be reasonable, and the regulators, of course, would as well, based on the profile of your business, the number of accounts, and the activity that we're talking about here. As we talked about on the CCO rule, 20647 requires that you have a compliance program that's effectively designed to prevent violations of the securities laws. And when you're dealing with held away accounts, you really follow the same compliance oversight requirements that you do for accounts that you have internally. So everything from your agreements to your investment philosophy and process, and how you profile clients, take them through suitability, act as a fiduciary, and of course, securing and maintaining the privacy of their data, and making sure that your team understands, how to deal with and handle all aspects of the client relationship and the compliance responsibilities. For the technology front, it's crucial because compliance is one of those is one of the must-haves in any advisory practice. But the cost of compliance go down dramatically if you implement the right technology. The key here is to make sure that you're compliant without even working at it is the ideal. And being a combination of your people, your talent, processes that you put in place, and the technology you leverage is really going to determine your risk level and the amount of effort that you need to put forth with compliance. So obviously there's other components to it that you need to manage on a daily and an annual basis. But the key components are focus on risk management. Think of good controls and good flow of data, how and where you maintain your books and records, how you maintain and secure client information. From the investment perspective, how do you define risk? How do you define risk at the portfolio level? How do you define it at an account or a relationship level? So think through all those components, which all make perfect business sense, but surprisingly enough, they're also compliance requirements.